Hi there, and welcome back to 19th Century Art. In this, our fourth and final part of the sublime and the grotesque, our investigation into romantic tendencies in early 19th century art. We're going to go across the Atlantic to examine the work being made in the American frontier. In the early 19th century, American art was deeply engaged with neoclassical ideals. You can see here on the left, Hiram Powers, the Greek slave, is a fairly typical offering, a rather exquisitely carved female nude with all of the classical trappings of realistic anatomy and finely realized drapery. And the chains, all of this shows the extraordinary and exceptional skill of the artist, while the subject renders the female figure in this subservient way, as if she is completely resigned to her humiliation. The contrasting image we have by an American woman, Harriet Hosmer, who represents Zenobia in chains in a much more noble manner. Here, the woman Zenobia, legendary character, is lifting her chains up. She is dressed and still retains her nobility, even though she is enslaved. The contrast between these two images of both slavery and women identity is part of the ongoing dialogue about how to engage with classical themes in a way that is and resonates with the American experience. We also have an extraordinary African American, Edmonia Lewis, who is one of the first African Americans to really take on the art world in a serious manner. She began to gain prominence during the American Civil War, and at the end of the 19th century, she remained the only Black woman who had ever participated and been recognized to any degree by the American artistic mainstream. Here she shows us the death of Cleopatra in this very noble way. The revealed breasts is intended to show her as a woman who, and in her dying, we see her gracing the throne with dignity. Cleopatra was an important symbol for the African American community because she represented an African queen who chose to die by her own hand rather than be subjected to slavery. In the American West, many people across the globe were fascinated by these exotic and extraordinary noble figure of the American Indian, and a number of artists were fascinated enough with this figure to travel to the West and begin to paint what was at this time already a dying civilization. Here, George Catlin's White Cloud, chief of the Iowas, between 1844 and 1845. Catlin was a self-taught artist who really made it his life's work to engage in the subject of the Native Americans of the frontier. And we see in his self-styled self-portrait, we see him surrounded by Native Americans. He has taken on the clothing of a frontiersman, and he is embodying the nobility of this quickly vanishing culture. In 1832, he traveled more than 1,800 miles up the Missouri River from St. Louis. By decade's end, he had painted more than 500 portraits, scenes, and landscapes and accumulated an astonishing collection of Indian artifacts. He exhibited his collection in major American cities, and in 1839 he crossed the Atlantic to display his Indian gallery in London and eventually in Paris and Brussels as well. Here is a typical George Catlin painting of a buffalo hunt. Again, he is painting scenes and imagery which are capturing events of how the Native Americans traditionally lived before the arrival of Western civilization. So in a sense, he's trying to reclaim, he's trying to establish what was their life before the arrival of the American settlers, a world that was very difficult to find in the mid-19th century. Many Native Americans had begun to settle and adopt Western ways, and the Cherokee had even developed their own alphabet and writing system. Here is Sequoyah, the inventor of the alphabet. He was, prior to creating this alphabet, an illiterate man who knew no other language but Cherokee. And in an extraordinary insight into the Cherokee language, he was able to develop this alphabet and quickly teach it to his Cherokee nation, which brought about a transformation in the Cherokee culture. They had hoped to be recognized as a sovereign state. They developed their own constitution and written set of laws. The language was formally adopted by the Cherokee Nation in 1825, and by 1828, there was already a newspaper printed in Cherokee, and by 1830, 90% of the Cherokee were literate in their own language. This is an astounding success story in literacy. Unfortunately, by 1830, the Cherokee and the 4 other civilized nations, as they were referred to, the Native Americans who had adopted the American colonial ways, were all banished from their homelands. All their civil rights had been negated, and they had been sent on the Trail of Tears to the far west. The image of the Native American would continue to inspire fear and a sense of the outlaw and the renegade. Here, the painting, The Abduction of Daniel Boone's Daughter by the Indians by Charles Wilmar in 1853, is representing a scene that happened 77 years earlier. It was quite a sensational moment. The girls were captured by a Cherokee Shawnee raiding party on July 14, 1776, and were rescued 3 days later by Daniel Boone and his party. Celebrated for their success, Daniel Boone would become a political figure in the U.S. Congress. None of the women were injured or molested by the Indians, but the Native Americans involved were all captured and killed. The incident was portrayed in the 19th century literature and paintings. James Fenimore Cooper crafted a fictionalized version of the episode for his novel, The Last of the Mohicans. So this is a well-known story, and it continues to propagate the idea that the Native Americans were savage and lawless. And the great civilizing force, the expansion of the West. Here we see George Caleb Bingham's Daniel Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap, this idea that they are bringing to this wild, untamed wilderness the new American way. And this was part of a program that became known as Manifest Destiny, which was the way in which we were destined by some higher power to rule over this vast country and bring civilization and order and law to it all. The figure of the frontiersman, such as Daniel Boone, was a very romantic image, a person who was there to lead settlers, to battle the Indians, and one very highly celebrated frontiersman was William Frederick Cody, otherwise known as Buffalo Bill. His story was serialized in novels. It was also made into a movie. The novels were so popular that William Frederick Cody decided to take his show on the road and created a Wild West show with the Congress of Rough Riders of the World. and he toured the U.S. and brought exotic foreign world to life for the European audiences. He toured Europe 8 times. His last tour was in 1908. Many claimed at the time Buffalo Bill was the most recognized celebrity in the world, and he really established this idea of the Wild West and all its mythology. Now, what's really interesting to me is the way in which the frontiersman has largely vanished from our concept of this expanding and opening up the West, and instead it's been replaced with this very brief idea of the cowboy, which really only existed late in the 19th century, from about 1865 to 1895, about a period of 30 years. The cowboy has become ensconced in our culture to a much higher degree, battling Indians, as we see here in the Dash for the Timber by Frederick Remington, who became a highly celebrated painter of the American West, and the cowboy, and much of the iconography and the way in which we envision this romantic image of the cowboy comes from Frederick Remington's depiction of that time. It was already at a time when the cowboy was waning and had largely begun to disappear. And so Remington, again, like earlier, is celebrating a distant past, but in this case, a past that never existed. The cowboy is here battling Indians, which is something that was not historically the case. More realistic representations of the manifest destiny and the drive to the West can be seen in Henry Farney, where we are foregrounded the plight of the Indians here migrating through the snow, displaced by this train that is cutting through the landscape. Their time seems to be fading, and the train moving into the landscape seems to be the new dominant force. Here we see men, women, and children and their dogs and their simple way of life being pushed to the margins by the emerging American technology. But it is the image of the cowboy that we continue to celebrate and is a part of the iconography of so many ads and so many parts of the way people see the American West. The American Indians themselves had their own images and icons, beginning with the introduction of horses, art that celebrated victories in battle, and other important cultural events have been inscribed on the rocks throughout the far west and the southwest. Here we see one of the largest and most complex depictions in the American Indian tradition, the Retreat Up the Hill battle, found on the region called Writing on Stone, where thousands and thousands of petroglyphs can be found in Alberta, Canada. This represents the battle as the American Indians were further driven from their lands and captured and put on reservations, displaced from their homelands, living in Western forts. They would be given the paper that was left over in the ledger books, which they took to illustrating stories of their past, trying to record things as they knew and remembered them from their own memories, so they would not die and disappear with them. And so the Cheyenne have a long tradition of a art representing their heroic victories and battles, and it has a very stylized and formal way of capturing the qualities that were important to those events in a very symbolic way. We see the guns, we see the horses displayed with all their power. One of the most interesting works of art to come down to us from this time with this Target record book by the Native American known as Silverhorn or Huangua. In 1890s, he was living on a reservation, and he chronicled his days through a series of symbols where each symbol represented an event in the camp. And what's interesting about these many pages of his calendar as he drew out what was happening and the events, the traditional symbols of daily life, the seasons, the animals, and their events disappear, and more the rhythms of camp life take over his calendar until it ends completely. Trying to record the past was something that was quite a challenge to Native Americans who had not found a writing system like the Cherokee. Silverhorn was famous for doing paintings of the mythic past, trying to remember the important spirits and deities that he was told of in his childhood, also recording the births and deaths of important people in the community. This kind of iconography is all we have of this ancient way of life. Here is a contemporary artist, Henri Chagoya's take on the abduction of Daniel Boone's daughter by the Indians, Charles Wilmar's painting of 1853. In Chagoya's reimagining of that moment in art, he has ennobled the Native Americans, making them look like defenders of their territory, repulsing these interlopers, these illegal aliens who had come onto their land and were destroying their way of life. And so he has shifted the narrative on the idea of what and who is an immigrant and who is a native. Chagoya scrambled the identities of the figures who take on heads borrowed from different indigenous communities, while Chimina becomes a cartoon duck. In doing so, the artist calls attention to the irony that people living on historically stolen land carry hatred toward foreigners.